The laughter started on the left side of the room and spread like something contagious. It wasn't the polite kind. It wasn't the kind people deploy at office parties when the VP makes a bad joke and everyone performs amusement. This was genuine, loose, unguarded, and mean in the way that laughter becomes when a group of people have decided, collectively, that someone in the room doesn't belong there. The someone in question was standing near the service entrance of the 38th floor boardroom of Hargrove and Tessier Financial Group, holding a mop bucket that had a squeaky left wheel. He had brought it in because one of the catering staff had knocked over a pitcher of water near the credenza, and no one had called anyone else to deal with it, so he'd come up himself. His name was Eugene Calloway. He was 53 years old, and he wore the gray uniform of a commercial cleaning contractor. The kind that had seen so many industrial washes the logo on the chest had faded to a ghost of itself. His boots were steel-toed and scuffed. His hands, if you looked at them, were the hands of a man who had worked with them for a long time. He didn't look up when the laughter started. He kept his eyes on the wet patch near the credenza and moved his mop in the slow, efficient way of someone who had learned not to waste effort. "Translate this," said the man at the head of the table, holding up a thick bound document and looking directly at Eugene with an expression that was more display than feeling. Meant for the room, not for Eugene. His name was Garrison Price, and he was the chief operating officer of Hargrove and Tessier, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had confused never being corrected with always being right. "Go ahead. My salary's yours if you can." More laughter. Someone at the far end of the table said something under their breath that produced a second wave. Eugene Calloway finished mopping the water near the credenza. He set the mop back in the bucket. He looked at Garrison Price with the measured patience of a man who has heard much worse and decided on most occasions that a response was not worth the energy. Then he glanced at the document. "That's the Dreyfus-Beaumont acquisition contract," he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft, just quiet. The way things are when they don't need volume to carry weight. Draft 4, from the look of the binding. Are you on the indemnity clauses yet? Or still in the representation section? The room went still. Eugene Calloway had lived in the same house in Scarborough for 11 years. It was a semi-detached with a furnace that made a sound like an old dog settling down for the night and a kitchen window that let in more cold air than it should have in January. He had meant to fix it every winter for 4 years. He hadn't fixed it yet. His daughter, Ivy, was 16 and did most of her homework at the kitchen table because her room was the warmer one, and she'd given it to her grandfather when he moved in 2 years ago. She didn't complain about this. Eugene noticed she didn't complain about it, and it was one of the things about her that made his chest feel full in a way he didn't always have words for. His father-in-law, August Renner, was 78 and had a bad hip and a sharper mind than most people Eugene had worked with at any point in his career. The first career, the one before. August had been a high school math teacher for 31 years and had very specific opinions about the correct way to load a dishwasher, all of which were correct. Eugene's wife, Marie, had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, progressed fast. There was a period after. Maybe 8 months, maybe a year. The timeline still blurred at the edges when he tried to look at it directly, where Eugene had operated at a level that was just enough to keep the household moving. Get Ivy to school. Make sure August took his blood pressure medication. Pay the bills in the order of which ones would cut something off first if ignored. He had sold the practice 18 months after Marie died. A small law firm, 3 partners, 12 years of building it from a shared office above a dry cleaner on Danforth Avenue. Corporate law, primarily. Cross-border transactions, M&A support, contracts that required someone who could read 4 languages and understood that the gap between what a document said and what it was designed to accomplish was often wider than the client realized. He had told people he sold it because he needed to scale back. He had told August he needed more flexible hours to be home for Ivy. He had told Ivy almost nothing because she was 12 when it happened, and 12-year-olds carry more than they show, and he hadn't wanted to add to whatever she was already carrying. The truth, which he had not told anyone, was that he had walked into his own office one Tuesday morning in November, sat down at his desk, and found that he could not make himself care about any of it. Not the contracts, not the clients, not the cases. He'd sat there for 2 hours and then called his partners and told them he was out. He'd taken the cleaning contract work 6 months later, mostly because it got him out of the house at regular hours, and regular hours were something a person could organize a life around. Hargrove and Tessier was one of 12 buildings on his rotation. He was there 3 mornings a week and 1 evening shift on Thursdays. He had never told anyone there who he was. Not because he was hiding it, exactly, more because it hadn't come up, and he had found, over the past 3 years, that people's behavior toward him without that information was instructive in ways that people's behavior toward him with it had never been. The silence in the boardroom lasted long enough to become noticeable. Garrison Price recovered first because men like Garrison Price had trained themselves to recover first. "Is that right?" he said, and his tone had shifted from mockery to a kind of cautious assessment, the way a person recalibrates when something doesn't behave the way it was supposed to. "Draft 4 of the Dreyfus-Beaumont acquisition," Eugene said again, without urgency. "If you're on the representation section, there are a few things in 4.3 through 4.6 that will need a closer look before any of this moves to execution." Across the table, a woman in a charcoal blazer looked up from her legal pad. Her name was Adrienne Tessier. She was 47, the founding partner's daughter, and she was one of 3 people in the room who hadn't laughed. The other 2 were a junior analyst who looked like he was reconsidering his career choices in real time, and an outside counsel named Warren Fife, who had been brought in specifically to review the acquisition documents, and who was now looking at Eugene with the focused attention of a man who had just heard something he wasn't expecting. "What specifically in 4.3 to 4.6? Adrienne asked. She asked it the way you ask something when you already have your own concerns and you want to know if someone else shares them. Eugene looked at her. She had the steady eye contact of a person who was used to rooms not taking her seriously and had learned to hold her ground anyway. He recognized it. The indemnity caps in 4.3 are structured so they reset on a rolling 12-month basis, he said, which sounds reasonable until you read it against the definition of covered event in Schedule F. The definition is broad enough that multiple related claims get treated as separate events, each with their own cap reset. A sophisticated claimant could sequence the same underlying issue into 4 or 5 separate claims and collect the cap multiple times. No one spoke. 4.5 has a material adverse change clause that excludes changes in general economic conditions, but doesn't exclude changes in sector-specific conditions. That's not standard language. That's a gap you can drive a very expensive truck through. And 4.6's governing law provision designates Delaware, which is fine on its face. But the arbitration clause 2 pages later specifies a venue in a jurisdiction that has a demonstrated history of awarding enforcement to the defendant party in cross-border disputes. That's not accidental. Warren Fife had stopped pretending to look at his own notes. "Those are traps," Adrienne said. "Not a question." "Yes," Eugene said. Garrison Price had gone very quiet. Not the reflective kind of quiet, the kind where someone is doing rapid mental calculations about a situation that has moved outside the range of outcomes they had prepared for. "Who are you?" he said. "I work for Halloran Cleaning Services," Eugene said. "I'm here for the water near the credenza." He finished mopping. He squared the bucket against the wall by the service entrance, the way he always did. He could feel the room watching him, but he had learned, over many years in many different kinds of rooms, to move at his own pace regardless of who was watching. He was at the service entrance when Adrienne Tessier said, "Would you wait, please?" It wasn't a command. It wasn't quite a request either. It was the particular register of someone who was trying to find the appropriate way to speak to a person they had abruptly realized they had been misreading. He waited. She came to him, which he noted. She didn't call him over, didn't gesture toward the table. She crossed the room and stopped a reasonable distance away and said, "What you just identified, do you know how long our legal team has been reviewing this contract?" "I wouldn't know," he said. 3 weeks, she said. "Warren has been on it for 3 weeks. He didn't say anything to that." "How did you?" She stopped herself, reframed. "Do you have a legal background?" "I did some contract work," he said, which was true. She looked at him for a moment. She was trying to read the gap between what he was telling her and what was probably true, and she was smart enough to feel the gap without being able to measure it. "Would you be willing to sit down and walk us through the rest of the document?" she said. "I'd compensate you for your time, properly." Behind her at the table, Garrison Price looked like a man who had said something at a dinner party that he could not unsay. His name wasn't in any of the trade publications anymore. He'd been in a few 12 to 15 years back. A brief mention in a financial law journal when the firm handled a significant cross-border restructuring, a quote or two in pieces about mid-market M&A in Ontario. None of it amounted to much by the standards of people who measured their careers in press coverage. He had never been interested in that. What he had been interested in, for most of the 30 years he practiced, was the contract itself. The way language either did what it was supposed to do or quietly failed to do it. The way a document could read as reasonable on the surface and function in practice as something quite different. It was not glamorous work, but it was real work, the kind that had actual consequences for actual people, and he had found a satisfaction in it that he'd never been able to fully explain to anyone outside of it. After Marie, after the practice, after the months that blurred, he hadn't missed the work exactly. He'd missed the clarity of it. The thing a problem had when it was properly stated, the way a contract either held or didn't, independent of anyone's feelings about it. He'd gone back to reading on evenings when Ivy was studying, and August was watching his programs. Not with any particular purpose, just because it was the thing his mind knew how to do. They set up in a smaller meeting room. Someone brought coffee. Warren Fife had the document open on a laptop and a printed copy beside it, and he had the slightly humbled posture of a competent professional who has just had a peer review go unexpectedly. Eugene sat across from Adrian and worked through the contract section by section. He went carefully. He was not performing expertise, he was using it, which looked different. When he found something, he explained what it was and what it was designed to do and what the consequences of missing it would be. He did not editorialize. He did not say, "You should have caught this." He just described what was in front of them plainly in the way you describe something once you have understood it well enough to see it clearly. 4.3 through 4.6, as he had flagged, but also a liquidated damages provision in Section 7 that cross-referenced a formula in an appendix that contained a variable not defined anywhere in the main document. Also a non-solicitation clause in Section 9 that was drafted broadly enough to potentially capture Hargrove and Tessier's own employees if they were ever hired away by a subsidiary of the acquiring entity. Also a warranty in Schedule D that was qualified by a materiality threshold that had been defined at a level so low as to be essentially non-functional. They wanted this deal to close, Warren said at one point. He was not making an excuse. He was thinking out loud. They wanted it to close on terms they could benefit from later, Eugene said. The contract is written to look like a standard acquisition. It's not. Adrienne had stopped taking notes about 20 minutes in and was simply listening with the focused attention of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation in real time. "What would you do," she said, "if you were advising us?" "I wouldn't sign this in its current form," Eugene said. "I'd go back to the other side and tell them you've completed your review and you have questions about the drafting in several sections. Keep it neutral. Don't accuse anyone of anything. Just identify the specific language that needs to be reconciled and ask them to provide a revised draft. You want to see whether they fix it, which tells you one thing, or push back and say the language is standard, which tells you something else. And if they push back, then you know the language isn't accidental," he said, "and you have a decision to make about whether this is a counterparty you want to be in business with for the next 10 to 15 years. Adrienne looked at Warren. Warren looked at the document. Garrison Price had not come into the smaller meeting room. Someone had told Eugene quietly that he'd left for another commitment. They finished at 3:30. Eugene had a building on his rotation at 4:30 in Etobicoke, and he'd need to get back to his truck and drive. Adrienne walked him to the elevator. She had the manner of someone who was still processing and was too honest to pretend otherwise. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want to be straightforward about it." "All right," he said. "You have more than a cleaning background." It wasn't a question, so he didn't answer it as one. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," she said. "That's your business. But I'd like to have a conversation, if you're open to it. Not today, whenever works for you." The elevator came. He stepped in and held it for a moment. "I'll be back Thursday evening," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He picked up Ivy from her after-school program at 5:15. She got into the truck and dropped her backpack at her feet and pulled her seatbelt across and said, "How was your day?" in the way teenagers ask when they're actually asking, not just filling space. "Interesting," he said, which was honest. She looked at him. She had Marie's eyes and his stubbornness and a very accurate sensor for when something had happened that he wasn't telling her about. "Interesting good or interesting complicated," she said. He thought about the boardroom, the laughter, Garrison Price's face when the room went quiet, Adrienne Tessier standing at the elevator and being honest enough to say she didn't know what she was looking at. "I'm not sure yet," he said. She nodded. She'd learned. She'd had to learn, which was the hard version of learning, that there were things that needed space before they became words. She put her earbuds in and looked out the window at the January dark coming down over the highway, and he drove them home. August had made pasta, the good kind, from scratch, with the pasta machine that had belonged to Marie's mother and that lived on the top shelf of the pantry and came down on occasions August deemed worthy. Eugene came in through the back and hung up his jacket and washed his hands at the kitchen sink and looked at the man sitting at the table with a glass of ginger ale and a folded newspaper and thought, not for the first time, that he did not know what he would have done without this. "Long day?" August said without looking up from the crossword. "Medium," Eugene said. "Ivy told me you said interesting." "I told her I didn't know yet." August put his pen down and looked at him over his reading glasses. He was 78, and his hip hurt, and he was the sharpest person in most rooms he entered, and he knew Eugene well enough, through Marie and through the years since Marie, to read what was under the surface of things. "Whatever it is," August said, "you'll know when you need to." Eugene poured himself water and sat down across from him and looked at the newspaper and thought about the document and the way language works when it's designed to look like one thing and function as another, and what it meant that he still knew how to see it, even after everything. On Thursday evening, he came back to the 38th floor with his cart. The building was mostly empty by 7, which was the point of the evening shift, quieter. He liked the quieter. Adrienne Tessier was in a glass-walled office near the end of the corridor, working. She saw him through the glass and raised a hand, not summoning, just acknowledging, and went back to her screen. He did the lobby and the common areas first. He didn't rush. At 8:15, she came out with 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the break room and set one on the credenza near where he was working. "When you're ready," she said. He finished the section he was on. Then he took the coffee and followed her into the office. She had the revised draft from the counterparty's legal team open on her screen. They had changed 4.3. They had left 4.5 and 4.6 alone and offered a 1-paragraph explanation for why the language was, in their view, standard. He read the explanation, he read it. They adjusted the one clause that was easiest to defend publicly, he said, and held the 2 that do the most work. She had already come to the same conclusion. He could tell. She had waited to hear him say it. "I've been thinking about how to handle the next step," she said. "I don't have the bandwidth to manage this in-house right now. And Warren is good, but he's fine for what he was brought in to do," Eugene said, without judgment. "Yes," she said, "but this is something different." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to bring you on, formally if that's possible, as a consultant on this transaction and possibly others. I'd need to understand your actual background, credentials, what you're comfortable with." He set the coffee down. "My name is Eugene Calloway," he said. "I practiced corporate law in Ontario for 22 years. I closed the practice 3 years ago. I'm currently licensed but inactive." She absorbed this. "Why the cleaning work?" she said, not dismissive, genuinely curious. "Because I needed something to do that wasn't law for a while," he said. "And then it became what I did, and then I stopped thinking about it much. And now?" He was quiet for a moment. Thought about Ivy asking whether a thing was interesting good or interesting complicated. Thought about August's pasta in the kitchen window that still let in too much cold and the way a document either held or it didn't. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm here." She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. "Then let's start there," she said. He didn't tell Ivy that night. He came home at 9:30 and she was at the kitchen table with her homework, and August was asleep in his chair in front of the television with a documentary about migratory birds playing at low volume. He made himself toast and sat across from Ivy and listened to her talk about a history project on the Winnipeg General Strike that she was actually interested in, which happened maybe half the time, and he answered her questions when she had them, and he did not mention Adrienne Tessier or the contract or the 38th floor. But later, when he was standing at the kitchen window washing his mug, looking out at the backyard, just the blue dark of January and the shape of the old maple tree, and the fence his neighbor had repaired last summer, he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement exactly. He was 53, and excitement was a young person's word for something that aged into something quieter and more durable. What he felt was closer to the particular steadiness of a compass finding north, a thing clicking into alignment after a long time of being slightly off. He didn't know what would come of it. Consulting arrangements had their own complications. Getting back into it, even partially, would mean paperwork, phone calls, conversations he hadn't had in 3 years. It might not work. The firm might decide they wanted someone with a current practice. He might decide, once he was back in it, that he'd left for better reasons than he remembered. But Adrienne Tessier had shaken his hand and said, "Let's start there." And it had sounded like someone meaning it, and he had found that he was willing to find out. He dried his mug and put it on the shelf and turned off the kitchen light. In the other room, Ivy's pencil moved steadily across paper. Outside, the maple tree stood in the January dark, holding what it had, the way things do when the season asks them to. He went to bed. He slept.